Hello, this is Derek Hansen, and this is my second performance video essay. And in this edition, I wanted to speak specifically about ACL injuries.
Here's Mitchell. Look at it's not an illegal pull down. He just kind of gets caught there, and right. That's not illegal. Nothing worthy of a penalty there. Mitchell just steps up. He's in the field of play, gives a last little shove. Nothing egregious here.
We're going to talk a lot about ACL injuries in the NFL. When somebody has something like an ACL injury,
Bradford drops the pass again, floats it to the far side, intercepted by the Badger, and then falls down to the 38-yard line, and he might be shaken up.
Or a Achilles rupture.
You'll see a little ripple in the back of his left calf right there. Something popped, and he went down.
Right then and there, you know that they're going to be off for the rest of the season, maybe longer in terms of their rehab and getting back to a point where they're going to be fit to play. Certain players play a real part in the success of the team. So if you lose somebody at a key position, you know, it could change the whole course of the season for the team. We're going to look at ACL injuries, talk a bit about the implications. I have the honor and pleasure to be speaking at the 2018 NFL Combine to the athletic trainers for all the teams. And I'll be speaking specifically on hamstring rehabilitation, and I think the hamstring has a lot to do with the ACL based on my experience and some of the experts that I talked to, and I'll be fortunate enough to speak with people like Dr. Tim Hewitt, who will also be speaking about ACLs. I'm not an expert on ACLs. I had the pleasure of working with people like Rob Panariello, who's probably seen 20,000 plus ACL rehabs over his career.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like the velocity of the game. They're not prepared for that. The ability to react. You know, coefficient of the surface, coefficient of friction, all that. And Al brought up a good point. These guys don't hit in preseason because they're afraid they're going to get hurt.
When we look at this type of injury, I want to look at why are these things happening? What can we do to minimize the incidence of these injuries? And I'm very careful about saying words like preventing injuries, especially in a game like football, where it's such a violent game, collisions at high velocity. I think if you get into a mentality that you're going to prevent something, you know, it can backfire really quickly.
Inconceivable. 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 Inconceivable! You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
So I like to look at it as doing your best to make people resilient and having a plan in place should something bad happen.
Steven Telek, watch this. That's after he sacked Aaron Rodgers on the last series on a celebration for getting the sack. It looked like something kind of caught or popped or something.
So one of the first things we do when we look at an occurrence of an injury in a sport, in a particular league, we look at a lot of the data, the historical record of what has happened in the league, what has changed, what factors have contributed to any change in the statistics, whether that's an increase or a decrease. And we want to make sure we have the best possible idea on why something is occurring, why something might be minimized. And in this case, if we look at the ACL injury stats, we're looking at about 40 ACL injuries as we head into week 6.
They do believe it is a torn ACL with potentially some other damage as well, so that might be, that of course would mean he is out for the season.
The historical record shows that whatever number you've had in the preseason, you typically double that number. And if we look at our preseason numbers, we're at 31 ACLs, so that's going to put us over 60. In 2012, we had 60 ACL injuries. In 2013, we had 65. Now, this is above what would normally be expected for an NFL season. And in the past, I would say on average, there's probably been about 40 injuries per year since the 1990s. And so I started looking at the research. There's a number of papers that look at ACL injuries in the NFL and in football in general. If you look at a study by Bradley in 2002, he examined the seasons between 1994 and 1998, so a 5-year period where there were 209 ACL injuries in the NFL. So on average, about 42 per year. And in this study, when he looked at grass versus, at that time it was AstroTurf, it was about a 50-50 split in the injuries. So one wasn't perceived to be more dangerous than the other in terms of knee injuries. Now, one thing that I did notice from the study was that only 21% of all the injuries were non-contact injuries. Whereas when I look closer at the stats that we're seeing today, I estimate that we have over 40% of ACL injuries happening in non-contact situations. Or very, very subtle contact, maybe somebody's hand on somebody.
The field goal, he probably made Matt Bryant miss, and he's celebrating here, but then in that moment, Ron, it looked like when he went over to the sideline, he was hurt.
But mostly caused by the body, momentum, how a foot plants. In 2014, there was a study by Dodson who looked at the period between 2010 and 2013, so a 4-year period of ACL injuries, and he found that there were 219 ACL injuries. And this is the period in 2012 and 2013 where the ACL injuries were up to 60 and 65 respectively. The interesting point there was that there were changes to the collective bargaining agreement in 2011 that required less off-season training time for the players. Now I'm going to touch on my thoughts and the thoughts of other experts of why that's occurring, and especially over the last decade, why these numbers have increased. So once you've had a chance to look at the data and see that there's an increase in ACL injuries, and I'm not just talking about football, it seems like, you know, I use the word ACL epidemic.
Let's see how he comes down on the left leg. Keep an eye on the left leg. There. Yep, when he planted, that's when whatever happened. Let's see here.
Yeah, it's before he comes down. It's the plant right there on that left leg.
Some give.
Up just awkwardly on the turn, trying to cross over and right away grab that left knee. See the plant, the left knee right away.
Well, what happened here exactly? Oh, there we go. Bizarre celebration.
Even at the youth level, you know, I have friends with children under the age of 10 getting ACL injuries and requiring surgery. And a lot of the people that I know who work in the physical therapy side of things, the medical side, are seeing the same thing. So it's not getting better. If anything, it's getting worse. The NFL provides us with a window, you know, a high profile window under which to examine this more closely and see if we can come up with some good answers on how to minimize the incidence of these injuries. So if we look at different causes of ACL injuries, particularly in the NFL, one of the first things that comes out is the fact that a lot of these games are played on turf. Coaches talk to me about the interaction of the shoe and the turf, and you know, they use words like grabbing, getting caught in the turf, and I can see that relationship being front and center of a lot of the discussions. Back in the old days, in the 70s and 80s, there was AstroTurf, and people thought, okay, AstroTurf was the cause of a lot of injuries.
I'll tell you this much, and here's a true story, Derek Hansen. Old Fart Miller was in football all his life, either playing or standing on the sideline. In my later careers, after I got into my mid-50s, when we would go play on an AstroTurf field somewhere, I would get back to the airplane or get back on the bus after the game, or even during the latter part of the game. I'd start stretching my back out a lot, you know, and I think, geez, you know, boy, this game's got me excited. I'm tightening up. We would go and then we'd play, you know, get back out on grass and everything go away. Play on grass, it'd go away. Go back to the AstroTurf field again, tighten up. It had an effect on me just standing there. And I finally figured it out. So if it had an effect on me just standing there, just think what, you know, it would do if I were 26 years old out there running around hitting and doing all that stuff. It has an effect, although it's not as readily felt as what I did.
So the next generation of turf is field turf, where they have particles, rubber particles between synthetic blades of grass. And that was thought to be softer and you wouldn't get caught in there as easily as AstroTurf. But the other part of it is that as the interaction is not just about the turf, it's about how the shoe plants into the turf. The shoe companies are looking at ways to get greater traction in this new surface. And so the combination of the two, getting more traction, the interaction with the turf, has created some problems, and you can see this sometimes as an athlete lands in the turf and the knee buckles and it almost folds over as that foot plants.
Inside, here's Reggie. They got them all picked off there, and there was nobody on the back end of that field. And look at Luck grabbing his head afterwards going, oh my gosh, this is a walk-in touchdown.
And so I started to look at the research around this. There was a 2012 study by Drew that found that there was a 1.4 times higher likelihood of an ACL injury on turf versus grass. And that was between the seasons of 2004 and 2009. But then there was another study by Meyer in 2010 that found that injuries in general were higher on grass fields, 53% on grass versus 47% on turf. But there's a study by Hirschman in 2012 that shows a 22% higher incidence of ankle and ACL injuries on turf versus grass. Hirschman's paper covered the 2000 to 2009 period. So I started to look at the sport of soccer and ACL injuries. The research studies I looked at showed that artificial turf wasn't worse than grass. And I think there's a number of reasons behind that. And with all of these studies, whether it's looking at position in football, looking at when the injuries occur, I think a lot of the stuff has to do with velocities.
When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit.
So in soccer, you're not traveling at a high velocity as in football. Football, you reset. There's an intermittent quality in football that allows you to rest, recover, and go hard again. In soccer, it's continuous. In rugby, it's continuous. In a lot of other field sports, it's a little more conditioning oriented. The velocities are slower than what happens in football. So you're going to have lower force outputs on cutting movements and deceleration.
Oh. Jeez.
And aside from the turf, there's been a lot of talk about the actual shoes themselves.
Money's gotta be the shoes. Shoes. You sure it's not the shoes?
I'm sure, Mars.
Are they too grippy? Are they too stiff? I've watched a lot of old film of football being played in grass surfaces, and in the old days, you watch them play on a grass surface, they're tearing up that field. And after a game, it looks like somebody plowed the field. The new grass surfaces have way more resilience and durability than the old surfaces. If you're not tearing the grass, then the force is going to be dissipated up into the body. So even though it's a natural grass surface, there's some engineering behind it that make it closer to turf than maybe grass had been in the past. I think that's kind of clouding these differences between grass and turf now, and you still have shoes that are gripping very hard on these natural surfaces. So I think as part of this issue, we have to look at the shoes and the surface itself.
Help me. Help you. Help me. Help you. Help me. Help you.
Maybe there's a better combination of the two, where you have traction in certain planes of movement, but you have the ability to rotate and you don't get locked in. And I think in one of the discussions I heard by Dr. Tim Hewitt, he talked about this idea of that foot planting and not being able to rotate. If that heel lands, you're not rotating. Whereas if you're on the ball of the foot, there'd be a little more play in the foot and the ankle that would dissipate forces before it got to the knee. So the shoe-turf interaction is critical in looking at solutions moving forward. And I had a great discussion with Loren Landow, and he brought up a really good point that I hadn't thought of. The idea that you're working now with artificial compounds. You have rubber, you have these rubber pellets, and when they first install these fields, they're very fluffy. They've kind of fluffed them out, but he says what happens is, because you don't have the compaction, those fluffed up rubber particles actually create a spring-like effect. And those particles also have not just the vertical component springing, but there's rotational components.
The hardest one for the body to actually absorb is torque, especially at the knee joint. If we look at the vertical axis of the tibia, every time the foot hits the ground, the tibia is, let's talk right leg, okay? So the right foot hits the ground. When the right foot hits the ground, the foot is automatically going to pronate to some level and some degree. When the foot hits the ground, it corkscrews into internal rotation if we're talking the right tibia. So you have to think vertical axis going down the tibial shaft. It internally rotates. Well, what happens back in the day on AstroTurf and grass, that's exactly what happens. The tibia internally rotates, but what happens is you have dissipation of force via ground, dirt, etc. When on AstroTurf, you had time to rebound through the muscular system up the chain. The problem now, when you have condensed rubber, is rubber pushes back up the chain exponentially. So instead of dissipating out, that internal rotation actually turns into a very rapid external rotation. So you have excessive pronatory force, and then it goes right into a rapid supinatory force. And that's why when you saw Delvin Cook tear his, it looked benign.
Scary for the Vikings. See that knee?
And he reached for it right away.
Yeah.
It looked benign. My contention is that it's not the fact that the guys aren't strong enough eccentrically in pronation. It's the rapid recoil. It's like being on if you've ever got double bounced on a trampoline as a kid, it's that buckling thing. Well, it's happening in such fast time that it's shooting right up that chain and creating the excessive supination that the player isn't strong enough or ready for.
And he provided a really good example using a medicine ball, where he twisted the medicine ball, bounced it on a rubber floor, and you could see it recoil back the other way. It's not just about the vertical component. There's other rotational torque-like components in there where if you plant, that foot will have to deal with not just the impact vertically, but also the counter rotation of the forces going back up the leg.
But I think there's something to the rubber pushing up the chain, which grass and dirt, clearly we know ground reactive forces, but it's not exponential. It's not exponential and elastic. It's not elastic, which the rubber is.
If we start looking outside of the field itself, I always ask myself, okay, is the field a problem? What are the chances that that's going to be changed by the league? Are we just going to abandon all artificial fields? And I don't see that happening, so we have to look at other aspects of the problem.
I'm facing you and I'm shuffling to my right. When I decel, my right foot's going to excessively pronate, my left foot's going to excessively supinate. So every time I work on those cuts, I'm working on those extremes, and then I do different drills where I work on this teeter-totter balance point of pronation, supination, truly at the barefoot level, just trying to work on the control of it, because yeah, I can't time for that retrograde, but what I can do is prepare the nervous system to understand control of that mechanism.
The other part of it is the training side, and I talk in great depth with current strength and conditioning coaches in the NFL and some of the legendary NFL coaches from back in the 80s and 90s that I know. And there's big differences in terms of how the preparation is done, and a lot of it goes back to the collective bargaining agreement. In 2011, they made sure that the athletes only had to do strength and conditioning for 5 weeks, dedicated strength and conditioning. So you go 2 weeks of strength and conditioning plus another 3 weeks of strength and conditioning with individual workouts, and then you have 4 weeks of OTAs, so pretty much football practice. So that's 2 plus 3, it's 5 weeks. When I spoke with legendary strength coach Al Miller, he talked about the 16 weeks that he had with the majority of the team.
Oh man, yeah, but it paled, Derek, in the light of what we used to be able to do. We used to have 16 uninterrupted weeks. Then the great part about it is we had about maybe a 10-day down period before we went into training camp. So, it wasn't time for them just to go and melt away, really, you know what I'm saying? And then, just discard all of their training that they've had. So, yeah, great carryover training camp. Of course, training camp's 7 to 8 weeks, and, but still in the game, we didn't have that many injuries. Man, we would hit like nobody's business. I mean, every day was full of pass, just about.
When you look at the stats from the ACL injuries, what is the worst month for ACL injury? Well, it's August, which is training camp. So the combination of the loads of training camp, it's a competitive time. People are trying to make the team. You also have the preseason games. So you've gone from having 16 weeks to prepare for training camp down to 5 weeks plus a long break and then training camp. And this is exacerbating the issue. If you have people that aren't in shape, injuries are going to happen. You have to build an accumulation of work to make sure people are resilient. And I don't think that's necessarily happening in the same way that might have happened in the 80s and 90s.
The way the CBA works now, players are so much more limited in what they can do and how they do it that I think they miss that regulated, controlled workout session that really is directed by somebody who understands the sport, aka the strength coach, and can really prioritize some of these activities for them. You know, like most of you look at a lot of the ACL studies, you know, when girls do jump training, they don't have ACLs. And so, you know, why would it be any different for men or males? It's just, if you don't get exposed to that stuff, if you don't train reactivity, it doesn't come naturally. You aren't gifted with it in that sense. So I think then what happens when you lack that, and then you add in the shoes, the high coefficient of friction between the shoe and the field, you set yourself up for these kinds of things. And there's always going to be accidents. But I think if you have educated the body to react in a specific way, it will do so.
Coach Vermeil brings up some of the same issues with regards to the preparation side of it. And he brought up a good point, saying that a lot of the first teamers really don't play much in the preseason. They might play one quarter in game 1, 2 quarters in game 2, maybe 3 quarters in game 3, maybe less, and they don't play the 4th game. So, and there's been a lot of pushback by the players saying we don't want to play too many preseason games.
You have to practice it at the pace it's going to be played at, and you have to have contact. And you have to have a long enough training camp to gradually toughen the body to take that. You can't do 3 weeks. Now, if you don't want to have 2-a-days every day and go 1 day 2, 1 day 1, but go a good 4 weeks before you have, and here's the other thing. In the preseason, the first units aren't playing anymore. So now, if they're not playing and they're not practicing, now out of the gun, all of a sudden you've got to go out and play 4 quarters of offense or defense or whatever it may be, and you haven't played at game pace, and there's a difference between preseason game speed and in-season. Big difference.
Yeah.
So you have no contact. Basically, you have, first of all, no off-season. You have minimal contact in a shorter period of time, and no one plays in the preseason.
There's two sides to this. The athletes seem to want to do less, but also what's happening is the game's getting faster. And what happens in practice is if you have long 2-hour, 3-hour practices, and I spoke about this in my last video essay, as the velocities come down. If you try to do 100 reps with somebody on a route, guess what? They're going to down-regulate and they're not going to run fast. So when it comes time to the game, when they have long timeout periods, they have TV timeouts, you can rest up, now you're going faster. When you cut on that leg, if you're used to running in practice at maybe 15 miles per hour and now you're over 20 miles per hour and you cut off of a leg, what's going to happen?
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
You're unprepared, the tissue's not going to be ready, the muscles aren't going to react as quickly, the neuromuscular system's not going to be tuned. Vermeil also brings up a good point around the rules of the game and how things have changed. He thinks that now the quarterback has so much more time to throw, the receivers can get higher velocities on their routes. And a lot of this is about the rules around how you can block.
The biggest thing is you shorten the amount of time the quarterback's got to throw the ball, and that'll change everything. 15 yards for holding and call holding. If you're going to let them extend their arms, but as soon as you see a hold, call it, there'll be, and put intentional grounding back in. And make the quarterback a football player. Doesn't mean you can brutalize him, but make him, don't be so protective where you've given him, it'd be like fighting a war and your chances of getting killed are 1,000,000 to 1. Well, you're going to be a hell of a lot more wanting to go to war than if it's the real way.
And when I was watching some of these older games from the 70s, the interesting thing that I saw was that even the player movements were different. When a running back was making a cut, he had to take 3 to 5 steps to make that cut, as opposed to nowadays you see one leg cut hard and an athlete spring off of that leg. They can do that because they have the friction of the field in their shoes, whereas back in the day, if you took one step, you'd probably slide out. So you're taking 3, 4, 5 steps to make that turn and then accelerate, and that's not happening nowadays. So if I'm taking 4 steps to make a cut, 5 steps, the force is dissipated over those steps as opposed to one big step. And then another factor that a lot of people talk about, but I don't know if it's getting addressed, are the anatomical issues. Is somebody more susceptible going into a game, going into a season, because they're predisposed to injury? You talk about knee valgus, you talk about hip internal rotation, and ACL injury seems to be associated with a restriction of internal rotation abilities. So if you're not mobile in the hip, when it should have more range of motion, where's that stress going to go? It's going to go down into the knee. Just like the foot locking into the ground, if the hip isn't mobile, where's the stress going to be? It's going to be in the middle. We have to now focus on maintaining mobility through the hips, but also looking at ways to screen athletes to make sure that if they have these restrictions, that there's some strategies in place to help them with that.
What I've been finding clinically valid for a number of years now, and I resolve through force balance technique, is the overlooked pelvic obliquity. So consistently I'll have people come in and say either A, they were never checked for pelvic malalignment, or B, they were checked, but in their opinion it wasn't really the focus of treatment. So I'm here to say that it has to be the absolute focus of treatment for many reasons, and in particular relating to the lower kinetic chain.
I think the big thing to conclude from this whole talk is that this is a multifaceted approach. There's not one single thing that's causing these injuries. It's a convergence of all of these factors that are resulting in an increase in injury. And for me, I think one of the big issues around all of this is just the increase in velocity.
I feel the need for speed.
Everything else is kind of a spin-off of that. If I'm running faster and I have to cut, and I have internal hip restriction, and I have very grippy shoes that lock into the turf, and I have had minimal preparation, strength training, conditioning in the off season, and the ability to change direction, and I've challenged the muscles and I've challenged the central nervous system to make these changes and be able to turn on and off very quickly. If I've done all that preparation, then I'm in a better position. If I haven't, and I expect to do something really explosive and really fast on game day, I'm going to be in trouble.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
So because it's a multifactorial approach, we have to address everything, all of the components, all of the factors as best we can, and we have to adapt on our end. Like I said, if you can't change the rules, if you can't change the fields, if you can't change your equipment, what can you control?
The panda will never fulfill his destiny, nor you yours, until you let go of the illusion of control. Illusion? Yes.
Well, you can control the training side, you can control the recovery side, and we have to adapt as coaches and athletes to make sure that we have the best possible result moving forward. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking more on these and other subjects.